Hey guys, Zomfox here, and today we have some huge news from the USFL actually coming out about, yes, the schedule. The schedule for the season is just come out, and so we're going to quickly look at what Fox Sports article about it, talking about just some random basic stuff, and then the actual games, and then get into the details of the games. Are there overlap with the XFL? How are the hubs done? So this is for the USFL schedule, full 2023 week-by-week matchups. The USFL on Tuesday announced its schedule for 2023, with 4 different cities hosting games during Season 2. The new season kicks off April 15th, and each of the 4 host cities, Detroit, Memphis, Canton, Ohio, and Birmingham, Alabama, will have games within the first 3 weeks. Through the 10-week regular season, each of the USFL's 8 teams will play division rivals twice and teams the opposite division once, just like last year. You can go to the USFL site to go get a deposit on tickets. What a blessing to be able to bring America's favorite sport to more markets and create more excitement for our fans, said Daryl Johnson, the EVP of football operations. Our regular season matchups provide 10 weeks of highly competitive games. We're excited to start our new journey, and we're fired up to play in front of our new fans in 4 host cities. USFL begins April 15th with 2 games featuring 3 teams that made the playoffs last year. At Memphis's Simons Bank Liberty Stadium, the Showboats are going to be playing their inaugural home game against the Stars at 4:30, and then that will be followed by a primetime game at Protective Stadium in Birmingham between the Stallions and the Generals. Those teams were the 2 that played the kickoff last year that drew in 3 million viewers. Both opening games will be presented live on Fox, with the balance of the USFL 2023 schedule on TV being announced and announced the next couple days. We don't actually know what all the other games are on yet. We just know the time stuff. And then week 1 will continue with 2 games on Sunday, April 16th, with the Michigan Panthers and Houston Gamblers to meet in Memphis. That will be followed up by a matchup between teams with 2 new head coaches in the Maulers and the Breakers at 6:30 in Birmingham. Canton makes its regular season debut host city in week 2 at the Hall of Fame Stadium with a doubleheader between the Generals and Maulers and the Panthers and Stars. Detroit's Ford Field, home of the Lions, hosts its first games the following Sunday when the Maulers take on the Stars and the Panthers versus the Generals. For the 2023 season, the Birmingham Stallions and New Orleans Breakers will be hosted by Birmingham, the Maulers and Generals, Canton, Panthers, Stars, Detroit, and then the Showboats, Gamblers, and Memphis. The 40 regular season game matchups are listed below. The top 2 teams in both the North and South Division will battle in 2 playoff games in late June, with the winners following up the following week a title game. So we don't know technically when those games are, the playoff games, just in the regular season. So week 1, as we just heard before, Saturday, April 15th, the Stars will play the Showboats at 4:30 in Memphis, and then the Generals will play the Stallions at 7:30 on Fox as well. And then Sunday, April 16th, you have the Panthers at Houston and Memphis, and then Pittsburgh at New Orleans and Birmingham. Week 2, on Saturday, you have Houston versus New Orleans at 12:30, and Memphis versus Birmingham at Birmingham for both games at 7 o'clock. Then you have the Generals playing the Maulers at Canton, and then the Michigan Panthers playing the Philadelphia Stars at 7 as well. Then the week after, and notice something as well, every single game is Saturday and Sunday. They don't have any sort of Thursday, Friday, or Monday games. It's only Saturday and Sunday. Saturday, April 29th, you have the Breakers playing the Stallions at 12:30. You have the Memphis Showboats against the Houston Gamblers at 7 p.m. Sunday, you have the Pittsburgh Maulers against the Philadelphia Stars in Detroit at 12 p.m. And then at 4 p.m., you have Michigan versus New Jersey. Week 4, Saturday, May 6th, you have Houston versus Philadelphia at 1 p.m., Memphis versus Michigan at 7:30. Sunday, May 7th, you have New Orleans versus New Jersey at 3, Birmingham versus Pittsburgh at 6:30. Then week 5, you have, on May 13th, Pittsburgh versus Michigan at 12:30, Houston versus Birmingham at 4, and Sunday, May 14th, New Jersey versus Philly at 12, and Memphis versus New Orleans at 3 p.m. Week 6, you have Pittsburgh versus Memphis at 12:30, Birmingham versus Michigan at 4 p.m. Sunday, you have New Orleans versus Philadelphia at 12, and New Jersey versus Houston at 4. Week 7, on May 27th, you have Birmingham versus New Orleans at 4, and then Philadelphia versus Pittsburgh at 9. That is the only 9 o'clock game of the entire schedule. Just as an FYI, is that Philly versus Pittsburgh game on Saturday on May 27th. Then the next day, you have Houston versus Memphis at 2 p.m. Then you have Michigan versus New Jersey at 5:30. Then week 8, you have on June 3rd, Houston versus Pittsburgh at 12, and Philly versus Birmingham at 3. Then Sunday, you have Memphis versus New Jersey at 1, and then Michigan versus New Orleans at 4. And then week 9 on June 10th, Michigan versus Pittsburgh at 12, New Orleans versus Memphis at 3. Sunday, June 11th, Birmingham versus Houston at 2, Philly versus New Jersey at 7, and then finally week 10 on June 17th, you have Pittsburgh versus New Jersey at 1, Birmingham versus Memphis at 4, New Orleans versus Houston at 4 on the 18th, and then Philly versus Michigan at 7 p.m. So overall, I think that it is a very solid schedule for the most part. I do kind of wish that they had a game or two on a different day instead of just Saturday and Sunday, but it is still a very solid week overall to have and stuff like that. My guess for the playoffs, as an FYI, I'm assuming they're probably going to just do each week and stuff, because technically if they do that, their playoff game will be like July 1st or 2nd. So I think they're probably going to just have it be like heading into the next week, but we'll see. Now, as for some quick little actual tidbits about the schedule, in terms of times where 2 games are played at the same hub on one day, there are only 5 instances of that happening. Now, I think this is an overall big deal, especially for Canton. This is a great way to try and have people go to both games, mainly the ones where you have, let's say, the Houston Gamblers versus the Breakers, where no matter which stadium they're playing at, they're not playing at their home stadium yet, so there's going to be less people going there. But if you have another game that same day with the home team, there's a good chance you get some decent ratings, especially at Canton. Now, they do have 2 of those at Canton, those 2 games in one day, as well as Detroit, 2 of the new hubs. Memphis doesn't get a single one, and Birmingham gets 1. I kind of would have liked them to have, or try to have more at Canton, but I guess they sadly weren't able to do that. I think that would have just been really easy for them to try and get more fans to come, but I think that's one we're definitely going to see how fans do like it. Now, as for the thing you guys are probably most interested about, how does it affect the XFL? Is there overlap? Yes, there's actually a lot of it. I was expecting maybe a couple of games, but there's like a few. So for week 1 of the USFL season, you're going to have 2 games that overlap with week 9 of the XFL. On Saturday, you have at 7 p.m. for the XFL, you have the Orlando Guardians versus the San Antonio Brahmas. That game starts at 7 on ESPN2. Now, as for the USFL, on that same day, you have the New Jersey versus Birmingham game, which is on Fox at 7:30. So I think that that's a very, very strong way to start with your literal second game of the season, directly competing with the XFL. Now, with that, I do think that that game will outperform the XFL game. I think that it's pretty easy to see why. One of them's on ESPN2, one of them's on Fox. One of them is going to be a marquee matchup. One of them might be. Now, if we come time week 9 and, both the Guardians and Brahmas are playing for the playoffs, that could be different. But at least from the outset in, the USFL has the advantage there. As for Sunday, there's one overlapping game as well. The Michigan at Houston game played at Memphis is happening at the same time as the Renegades versus Defenders for the XFL. That game, I think, is going to be a pretty close one in terms of which gets me viewership. Only because of the fact that it's so late in the season, just like we saw with basically every other league, including the XFL 2.0, the ratings drop usually throughout the season. And I think that overall, when you're thinking about it, the fact that the Michigan versus Houston game isn't, a Memphis team playing, it's the 2 teams that don't actually, play there. I think there's a good chance that not too many people watch it, especially if it's not on NBC. But if it's on NBC, I think it should do better than the Renegades Defenders game. But if it's on like FS1 or something, the XFL should probably beat it. But because it's week 1, it still might. The next overlap, we only have 1 game for week 2. In week 2, they're competing with the week 10, 12 p.m. game on ESPN between the Guardians and Battlehawks. And the game that the USFL is playing is Houston at New Orleans. Another game where it's 2 teams playing at a probably somewhat empty stadium. Probably empty. So, I don't know if I'm a huge fan of them using those type of games to compete. I guess it's a way to just kind of test the water because, I think a lot of it is about the idea of how does the public look at it. And let's say the USFL beats the XFL, especially with them being at the Battlehawks. It would say that a league that has basically no people at the game outperformed a team that has like a rabid fan base, which looks good for the USFL. And if the USFL doesn't perform as well in the ratings, they can just say, well, it's because we didn't have fans in this game. I guess that's their reasoning, which I kind of agree with. Now we get to the playoffs. Yes, the USFL is challenging the XFL in the playoffs. Now, For the semifinal game, the first one on ESPN2, which is 7 p.m. on April 29th, that is directly competing with the Memphis at Houston game on Saturday the 29th for the USFL. Then, on the next day, you have the other semifinal game for the XFL, which is at 3 p.m. versus the 4 p.m. game, so it's basically about the same time between the Generals and the Michigan Panthers. Now, both these are going to be, I think these are the most intriguing ones. I do think the opening night one is a big deal, but I think these are even bigger because this is comparing the XFL playoffs versus just an early season game in the USFL. Now, I would imagine the USFL is going to put both those two games on NBC or Fox to try and directly compete with the XFL using their advantage of having, broadcast television rather than ESPN or even worse, ESPN2. If the USFL can beat either one of those games, that's going to be huge for them. If the XFL beats the USFL, it's just what they should do since it's a playoff game. Again, a low-risk, high-reward move for the USFL. And then the championship game. Yes, they're also competing in the championship game. The championship game starts at 3 p.m. on May 13th. An hour later, Houston at Birmingham is going to start at 4 p.m. That's also a pretty big matchup, especially considering when you realize the fact that that's the team that essentially ended Birmingham's chance to go undefeated last year. They were legitimately one game away, and then they ended up not doing it because of Micah Abernathy just basically putting a dagger in all the hearts of Birmingham fans. And the fact that that's their first matchup since that moment is going to potentially be a legit storyline. I think that that's a really cool thing to have, is a sense that that's a marquee matchup. Now, again, I would imagine they'd put that one on NBC or Fox to directly compete with the ABC game of the championship game. So I do want to know how that game goes. I think that one, the XFL should easily beat the USFL, whereas the other two playoff games, I'm not so confident just because of the network. You're talking about ABC as, yeah, it's not as good as NBC or Fox, but it's still broadcast TV, and that's all that really matters. And I think a title game versus a literal mid-season game, title game should do better. So overall, in terms of my thoughts of the schedule, I think that the schedule is a very solid one. Only having one game at 9 p.m., I wish they wouldn't have had any, but it's better than having like 6 like the XFL does, since those games historically did terrible last year. I think it's a very smart move to only have one, though they shouldn't have had any. And I like how they're competing with the XFL in a sense, as it seems like they're trying to just be the smart way of, if we lose, it doesn't look bad on us, but if we win, it looks great for us and bad for them. I do like that approach, and I do want to know if it pays off, but that's another thing we'll see. In the next few days, we'll find out what networks each of these games are on, and that's going to be another big deal to see what games that are competing with the XFL are on what networks, and we'll probably have the playoff details when that comes out as well. This has been ZomFox. If you enjoy this content and will be notified as soon as I upload any videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell, and as always, have a great night.